This is Duke University.
Hi, I'm Dan Vermeer, the Executive Director of the Center for Energy Development and the Global Environment at Duke University. I'm really pleased today to be here with Nick Shufro and looking forward to a conversation about some of the work that Nick does with the UN on climate resilience. Nick, glad to have you here.
Well, thank you, Dan. Delighted to be here and to talk about RISE, the new UN initiative.
Good. Tell us a little bit about your background in sustainability and what led to the work that you're doing currently.
Sure. I've been in the sustainability field for about 25 years, primarily focused on carbon accounting. So I've been involved in developing the greenhouse gas protocol and the Scope 3 standard, and have worked with a variety of organizations, companies, governments, municipalities, in terms of assessing their carbon footprints and identifying actions to reduce their impacts.
Good. So tell us a little bit about carbon accounting, and especially what Scope 3 means. That might be a new term for some people. I think it's a really interesting one because it's a much broader sense of the kind of footprint that a company is accountable to. So maybe you can just give us a little primer on scope measurement of carbon and why Scope 3 is so important.
So a little bit of carbon accounting geekiness.
101.
101. So the greenhouse gas protocol was developed in 1998, and it basically set a bunch of principles that companies and organizations across the globe could use for reporting on their emissions. So there was a little bit of comparability. And there are 3 scopes that were identified and defined by the GHG protocol, or the greenhouse gas protocol. Scope 1 is if you're directly emitting emissions. So if you're a utility and you're burning fuels, and those emissions are Scope 1 direct emissions. If you own an airplane fleet and you're flying that fleet and burning jet fuel, those are direct emissions. Scope 2 is utilities, generally referred to as electricity, but includes steam and chilled water and other utilities. And it's indirect emissions, and that is because you are asking a utility to create emissions on your behalf. And so you can have electricity, you can have heat, you can have air conditioning, etc. Scope 3, when it was originally defined, was everything else, or the kitchen sink. And it was everything from employee travel to downstream product use. About 10 years after the first carbon accounting standard came out, a Scope 3 standard was put out, and it identified 15 different categories that companies should report on. And why this is important is that the first carbon accounting standard really focused companies' activities on what was in their fence lines, what was in their boundaries. And a lot of companies have much more significant emissions from their supply chain or their downstream product use. Think of a major retailer that has a bunch of stores, and yet most of the emissions associated with their activities are manufacturing and transporting the products into their stores. Or an automobile company that makes cars, the amount of emissions associated with making a car is a lot less than over the lifetime of a car, the car's use. So Scope 3 was really intended to look at impact, and it's one of the trends that's come out over the last couple of years of looking at the value chain, including supply chain and downstream product use.
Excellent. So I guess that raises the issue for me is, why does a company want to invest in carbon accounting? Most of this, in most places, I guess, is voluntary. And so what's the strategic argument for why a company would invest heavily to understand the kind of full spectrum of the emissions that come from their business system?
I think to a large extent, if you make the investment of understanding where your emissions are, you can identify how to reduce those emissions. You got to figure that everything that is emitted, or if it's water discharge, or if it's waste generated, any of those outputs, those negative outputs, are wasted yield, their product that's not being used. So if you can reduce emissions, if you can reduce discharges, if you can reduce waste in some way or another, you can probably increase your yield from your products and have more efficiency in the system.
Right. Good. So I guess looking more broadly at the risk landscape that companies are facing, I know the World Economic Forum's risk report just came out citing water as being the primary risk on a global basis. Of course, these are going to be very specific to the types of industries and the geographies where they operate. But what are the kind of prioritization of risk that you see as you work with clients and with partners in the private sector? What are the kinds of issues that you see really on the rise in terms of their risk radar?
So water is something that is important to clients and to companies and organizations across the world. I think with the changes, climate change, we're seeing water, there's too much water in certain places and there's too little water in other places. And in a lot of cases you do need water to have operations, whether it's for your manufacturing operations or just for your local population to be able to, your workforce, et cetera. Which brings us back to this question of RISE, which is all around making investments disaster risk sensitive. The idea is that water is availability and quality is important, and so a lot of the things that we're looking at are around how slow creeping events like water shortages in Sao Paulo in Brazil are having an impact on local communities and forcing people to be moved.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the origins of RISE. What were the motivations for starting this initiative? What was missing in the world that this initiative is trying to address?
Sure. So the RISE initiative is a multi-sector project. It was launched in May of 2014 at the UN. It involves 6 different communities, so public and private sector, investors, insurance, educators, and civil society. We have 8 separate activity streams, and the idea is to do projects to bring these 6 different parties together, to introduce people who may not have been working together in previous formats, to brainstorm solutions and opportunities on how they can make both investments in infrastructure and just society much more resilient.
Mm-hmm. So what would you imagine the kind of best outcome of the RISE initiative? What would you hope to see in 10 years in terms of investment patterns, in terms of corporate strategy, in terms of public policy? Where do you see the kind of the opportunity space of kind of moving on making investments more disaster-proof?
So if you think about the fact that 60% of the critical infrastructure across the globe that will be in use in 2040 has not yet been designed. Mm-hmm. Not built, but not even yet designed. Mm-hmm. We have a tremendous opportunity right now to make some changes and to instill a little bit of common sense. So what you have is an opportunity to think about things now as opposed to having to retrofit and fix things later on. Mm-hmm. And so when you're sitting there, as an example, traditionally you've put wastewater treatment facilities by rivers or by seacoasts so that you can use the water. Well, that's great, except if you have sea level rise or you have severe flooding or severe events. So if you were to move those wastewater treatment facilities a quarter mile in or slightly off the rivers, you might have a better time and it might be better. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea is make some practical decisions, think about it in advance, and make it so that critical infrastructure is disaster risk sensitive.
That's interesting. I know from my work in, for example, the beverage sector, that there's been a real change in thinking as well, where they used to build bottling plants close to where the customers were, and that shortened the supply chains and reduced their costs, and that made a lot of sense. But these urban areas are often in places that don't necessarily have the long-term water resources that they need, given the competition for water in those urban areas. And so there's been a shift in thinking about moving the plants to where the water is instead of where the customers are. Now there's obviously a trade-off that means your supply chains are longer, yep. Maybe more vulnerable, maybe more costly, but I think companies are kind of beginning to wrestle with the kind of stability that they'll need for establishing their infrastructure. So it sounds like this initiative will help them become more sophisticated in thinking through those kinds of issues as well.
It will, and it also, there have been a number of incidents over the last couple of years where there have been global supply chain disruptions. Mm-hmm. The Japanese earthquake, mm-hmm. The flooding in Thailand, mm-hmm. And so one of the questions that's also coming up is, while we've all moved to leaner, just-in-time mm-hmm. Inventories and manufacturing operations, there is some need to have redundant supply chains and not necessarily co-located in the same facilities just because of severe events.
Right, right. You know, was fascinated with the way that John Holdren summed up our kind of choices around climate change. He said essentially we have three simple choices. One is, do we mitigate climate change? Second is, do we adapt to climate change? And three, do we suffer? And that we're going to do all three of those in some ratio over time. And it's to some extent up to us how we want to allocate our efforts against those things. Seems like adaptation was maybe an admission that we couldn't solve the problem, or it was seen that way in the past. But increasingly it's becoming more common that people are wrestling with what adaptation really means. Do you see companies getting more serious about adaptation, and what are the kinds of things what decisions is that driving?
So adaptation used to be a 10-letter, 4-syllable word that was not used. And it was viewed as a cop-out. You know, if you go back 5 years ago, 3 years ago, adaptation was something that the environmental community, you didn't really, you made much more significant efforts, and you didn't just sort of prepare for the inevitable. Having said that, I think Superstorm Sandy had a tremendous impact, at least on the east coast of the U.S. And so we're seeing a lot of companies starting to say, okay, well, we don't have to change our model completely, but we have to be a little smarter about it. And you know, when it comes down to it, yes, we are going to suffer. Our future generations are going to suffer for some of the mistakes that we've made and previous generations have made. It won't be as easy to get on an airplane to go fly to Europe for a weekend, assuming you have the financial capabilities, because there will be some additional costs that will be, you know, added in, as an example. Having said that, I think that, you know, if we can make it to the moon and we can do all kinds of things, we'll be able to figure this out. And I think companies are looking for, all right, we're going to adapt to this, we're going to figure out how to deal with it, and we're also going to look for opportunities, because there are opportunities, and that's the other part of the equation that most people forget about.
So Nick, can you tell me some examples of the kinds of companies that you see really understanding these issues deeply and taking ambitious action on them?
Yeah, so the companies range from very large companies to smaller companies taking significant steps. A very large retailing company actually tracks incoming hurricanes because they realize that after an event occurs, such as a hurricane on the East Coast or the Gulf Coast, that many people are going to be looking for replenishment of stock because they've got damaged homes, they've got to go out and replace their food, etc. So they actually will pre-position additional supplies in advance of a known hurricane coming through. Other smaller organizations, there was a small firm down in the southeast that basically makes pancakes, and the Waffle House. And they are very familiar with the fact that when storms hit, there are a lot of emergency responders who want coffee and some warm meals. And so one of their, you know, this is a smaller company, and one of their strategies is in advance of a storm coming through, they actually fly people from other parts of the country into the area in advance of the storm, so that once the storm is over and they're able to open, they can actually provide meals for first responders.
Do you see this driving new thinking around how to build infrastructure, maybe less centralized systems and more decentralized systems for electricity or for water?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability to island oneself and use microgrids is very much something that's happened. I think that we saw examples in Superstorm Sandy in Lower Manhattan, where there were certain organizations that had brought in generators and were able to actually have little microgrids and were in operation a day or two after the storm, versus other organizations that were out for several weeks. So I think that there is going to be an interest in decentralized energy transmission and distribution. And I think that when you think about the fact that a lot of our infrastructure, our utility infrastructure, is 100 years old, and you know it's falling apart. And you see that every day in every city. You know, bridges are are being repaired. You see cave-ins and things like that. I mean, it is, a lot of the infrastructure is near its end of its normal life, and so we are going to be, when we rebuild, we should consider rebuilding better.
Good. So I guess to conclude, I'd like you just to look in your crystal ball. Where do you expect the private sector to be around these issues in, say, 10 years from now? Are we getting traction that companies are really understanding the kind of broader implications of issues like climate change and water issues for their business? Are these becoming more institutionalized in corporate strategy, or where are we on that path, and where do you expect us to be in a decade?
I think many companies are doing business continuity activities, business continuity planning. They're doing enterprise risk management. I think what we're seeing is an evolution that in the past it's been, okay, what has been on your register, your risk register from previous years? Can you update it? Can you change it? And what we're looking at is sort of a longer time frame. So instead of looking at what are the risks that are going to may hit my company in the next quarter or the next 30 days or the next week or so, it's what are some of the issues that are longer tailed that might have an impact. And then also the second thing is that some of the issues may be what we call landscape level issues. They're not necessarily issues that I have any control over as a company, and considering those. So this whole concept of disaster risk management, in 10 years from now, I see companies embedding it into their operations. It won't be anything separate. It won't be a new department. It won't be, you know, a new title or a C-suite executive. It'll be, we're looking at this and we're looking at it from a little more practical perspective. We're looking at it longer term. We're looking at it broader than just what could happen to our organization.
Well, it's great to hear that companies are, you know, perhaps moving beyond the kind of polarized political discussions around issues like climate change and really wrestling with what the, you know, the impacts that they're seeing now and what they can anticipate, and building that into their strategies in real ways. Thanks a lot for the conversation today, Nick. I think this is really great to hear what not only the private sector but the UN and other partner organizations are doing to really try to you know, help to shift our infrastructure and our investments in ways that can be more resilient to the kind of changes that we expect long term. I really appreciate the conversation and look forward to welcoming you back to Duke soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure.